With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us right here on Tactics. We appreciate you joining us, whatever medium you happen to be looking at us on, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or Twitch or Periscope or Twitter. We thank you for being right here with us on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. As you can see by my awesome background that our graphic designer cooked up for us, Jessica Dawson, thanks for that. It is Thanksgiving. This is our big Thanksgiving Day special, which we do every year. And if you've been paying attention to this show for any amount of time, if you watch me throughout the month of November in any of my previous show's iterations, you know this is a really big deal for us. It's kind of like, we're sort of like the Friends of talk radio because it's my favorite holiday. A lot of people make a big deal out of Big Christmas. And to a degree, I do too. But ultimately, I just like Thanksgiving better. I mean, you're entitled to like what holiday you want, and I like Thanksgiving. I joke with people that it's the only religious holiday that I celebrate, but which is funny because most people don't think of it that way. They think of it in the sort of modern, sanitized version that we have as opposed to the National Day of Prayer and Thanksgiving, which was its actual original name. But thank you so much for joining the program, and one thing that we want to start out, and we try to do this every day, not just on Thanksgiving, we thank you, the audience, for making us a part of your busy day, and I will do my best, as always, not to waste your time by bringing you only things that are relevant and hopefully entertaining. As well, since it is Thanksgiving, I wanted to give you a quick look at the past 4 years that we've been doing this show and Thanksgiving, because like I said, I always make a really big deal about the Thanksgiving special. And we're doing it as we normally do a day early, because of course I take Thanksgiving off to be with my family. But in the past 4 years, what we have done is we have looked over different iterations of the Thanksgiving Day Proclamation from different presidents. Now, of course, we started with the original Thanksgiving Day Proclamation from our president, George Washington, but then you have a hiatus. And so what we actually did was we looked at Washington's Thanksgiving Day Proclamation, and then there wasn't one for a really long time. I mean, you had a couple here and there, but as far as what we traditionally think of as Thanksgiving being on the Thursday, the fourth Thursday of the month, that particular kind of Thanksgiving didn't become an annual thing until much later with Abraham Lincoln. And so you have occasional calls for days of Thanksgiving and prayer, but they weren't on that Thursday. It wasn't something that was solidified. And so that doesn't happen until the Civil War era in the mid 1800s. And then you fast forward, and there was talk of it being changed in the early 1900s, mostly for consumerism, with your FDRs and your Woodrow Wilsons. And that really kind of brings us to the holiday of Thanksgiving that we have today. But because of that, in the past 4 years, we first looked at Washington, then we looked at Lincoln, and then last year, we looked at President Ronald Reagan and one of his Thanksgiving Day proclamations. Now, from a completely selfish perspective, his was the easiest one for me to do because we have actual video footage of Reagan reading his Thanksgiving Day proclamation, so all I did was put up the clip. I mean, I figure Reagan can read his own proclamation better than I can anyway. Can't do that with, of course, Washington and Lincoln, nor can I do so with the proclamation that we're going to read today from 1924. This one comes from Calvin Coolidge, so I'm going to do my best to read this one. And just like Calvin Coolidge himself, it's something that you would expect from him. He was known as Silent Cal for a reason. This one's pretty short. He was a man of brevity. And he was known for that brevity. And so this one's not real long, but it is jam-packed with good stuff. I wouldn't say that it's quite to the level of Washington's. Probably not even so much to Lincoln's, but it's one of the best Thanksgiving Day proclamations, and I've read several of them from several different residents. This is one of the best ones, and I had a hard time selecting one of his because all of his speeches are really good. All of his Thanksgiving Day proclamations are really good. But I had a hard time picking, but I ultimately went with this one, and I think even though the content of the speech in and of itself is good, I think it's even better once you know the context. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and read it to you, and so you can get the sort of general overview, and then I'm going to fill in some blanks later with some context. So let's go ahead and look at Calvin Coolidge's 1924 Thanksgiving Day Proclamation, the second one that he administered, because of course he did the one in 1923 after Warren G. Harding wound up passing away. So let's go ahead and read this one. Thanksgiving, 1924, by the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. We approach that season of the year when it has been the custom for the American people to give thanks for the good fortune which the bounty of Providence, through the generosity of nature, has visited upon them. It is altogether a good custom. It is the sanction of antiquity and the appropriation of religious convictions, in acknowledging the receipt of divine favor, in contemplating the blessings which have been bestowed upon us, we shall reveal the spiritual strength of the nation. There it goes. The year has been marked by a continuation of peace, whereby our country has entered into a relationship of better understanding with all other nations of the earth. Ways have been revealed to us by which we could perform very great service through the giving of friendly counsel, through the extension of financial assistance, and through the exercise of a spirit of neighborly kindness to less favored peoples. We should give thanks for the power which has been given into our keeping, with which we have been able to render these services to the rest of mankind. At home, we have continually had improving state of public health. The production of our industries has been large, and our harvest have been bountiful. We have been remarkably free from disorder, and remarkably successful in all those pursuits which flourish during a state of domestic peace. An abundant prosperity has overspread the land. We shall do well to accept all these favors and bounties with a becoming humility, and dedicate to them the service of the righteous cause of the giver of all good and perfect gifts. As the nation has prospered, let all the people show that they are worthy to prosper by rededicating America to the service of God and man. Therefore, I, Calvin Coolidge, President of the United States of America, hereby proclaim and fix Thursday, the 27th day of November, as a day of national thanksgiving. I recommend that the people gather in their places of worship and at the family altars, and offer up their thanks for the goodness which has been shown to them in such a multitude of ways. Especially, I urge them to supplicate the throne of grace, that they may gather strength from their tribulations, and that they may gain humility from their victories, that they may bear without complaining the burdens that shall be placed upon them, and that they may be increasingly worthy in all ways of the blessings that shall come to them. So that is Calvin Coolidge's address to the nation, and there's several things that I wanted to point out to you in this. Before we dig into it, though, I think that it helps to really understand the context, because personally, I felt it most beneficial to read it first and then come back with the context, because I think doing so makes it more powerful in sort of a retroactive sense. You see, that was a really, really hard year for Calvin Coolidge. In 1923, he assumed the presidency after the loss of one of his best friends, Warren G. Harding. The Hardings and the Coolidges maintained a fairly close relationship from everything that I've read about them. I wouldn't say that it was his best friend per se. And I wouldn't say that losing Harding was like losing a family member, but it was a pretty traumatic experience for President Coolidge, and it took him some time to adjust. He was very unsure of himself. He's a very humble man, and he didn't know if he really deserved the presidency or not. So there were a lot of ways in which Calvin Coolidge had a very difficult time adjusting to the presidency. And just a year after that takes place, and after he becomes the president in July of 1924, the same year that this proclamation comes from, the greatest tragedy of Calvin Coolidge's life would strike when he lost his youngest son. Calvin Jr. was only 16 years old when he lost his life. And a lot of historians look at the autobiography or the biographies and the history of the Coolidge presidency and see how it devastated him and how it was very difficult for President Coolidge to get a lot of things done for a while after that. Now, eventually, of course, he did wind up doing so, and he did bounce back to a great degree and wound up even getting reelected, but that was a hard year for the Coolidges. And with him being lost in that manner, it was something that Calvin understandably never really recovered from. Now, I'm not a dad. I don't even have a son. I can't even imagine having a son, much less what it would be like to lose one. But I understand from people that have actually gone through this experience, and my great-grandfather and grandmother, my great-grandfather, who is still alive to this day, has survived 2 of his children passing. And my great-grandmother had 2 before she passed a couple years ago. And both from them and from other people that have gone through that experience, they've told me it is one of the most difficult things you will ever go through. Some people say it's even worse than losing a spouse. A lot of couples that wind up losing a child, their marriage can't survive after it because it is such a tragic and horrific experience. And for Calvin Coolidge to not only lose his son, but to do so and to be able to maintain his own sense of personal duty, and for him to continue on as the President of the United States, who by this point was a world superpower, it is just astounding at his level of dedication. But I think that makes this particular proclamation even more potent. And I'll point that out as I go through some of the points and do some of the highlights. But Calvin Coolidge is one of the strongest presidents that we've ever had. Because granted, this didn't happen until after this proclamation was issued. But he also lost his father and his stepfather while in office. And I believe it was shortly after he left office, but he also lost his stepmother. So he lost his father. I think I said stepfather. It was his father-in-law. Sorry, his wife's father that he wound up losing while in office. And Calvin Coolidge experienced a tremendous amount of loss while in office, and still was able to maintain his composure and be one of the most effective presidents in our country's history. I mean, from any measure, peace, the economy, he was a phenomenal president. And he ruled over a really amazing time of sustained peace and prosperity. And did all that with the baggage, personally, that he had to drag along with him. But let's look at some of the points of this declaration, because I really do think that they stick out more once you understand that context. Very early on, he actually says that we approach this season of the year when it has been a custom for the American people to give thanks for the good fortune which the bounty of Providence, through the generosity of nature, has visited upon them. So there's 2 basic things, and they're very basic, but sometimes the basic things are the ones that there's really what we need to hear the most, because they are so basic, because they seem so obvious, sometimes we gloss over them. That acknowledges 2 basic things about gratitude. First of all, that our blessings come from God, and that we owe God everything. That there is nothing that we have or have acquired that we can keep that is not there and able to be enjoyed by us because of God's bounty, because of God's generosity. The bounty of providence, to use Coolidge's words. And that's something that he wants to emphasize when telling the American people this is going to be a day that we're all going to set aside and be thankful for what God has given us. It's something that Coolidge wanted to make crystal clear in this declaration. And the second thing that he brings about is that it has been visited upon them. You see, the interesting thing about visit, what do you think about when you think about a visitor? Well, it's not permanent. A visitor doesn't live with you. A visitor comes by, stays for a while, and then goes away. And that's something that's important about gratitude too. Basically what he's saying is be grateful for your blessings because these bounties are visiting upon us. We're not always going to have this time of insane prosperity. And I think Coolidge knew that better than most because he had personally suffered a very tragic loss. The blessing of his son was a blessing that had merely visited upon him, not one that was permanent or guaranteed. And I think Coolidge knew that better than most because of what had just recently happened to him. Because if this death happened in mid-July, well, then that means it was just a few months until November when he was writing this. About halfway down in the second paragraph, he says this: ways have been revealed to us by which we could perform a very great service through the giving of friendly counsel, through the extension of financial assistance, and through the exercise of the spirit of neighborly kindness to less favored people. We should give thanks for the power which has been given into our keeping, with which we have been able to render these services to the rest of mankind. Now, that's an important aspect of gratitude as well. One thing that the Bible makes very clear about gratitude is that we should not only have gratitude for our blessings themselves, but gratitude for what our blessings allow us to do. You see, when we're grateful for example, our abilities, our intellect, the things that we've been given, we should only be grateful for them because they help us further the cause of Christ. And that's exactly what Coolidge is pointing to here. He's saying, let's give thanks for this great power and bounty that we've been given because look what it does. Not, oh, it makes us rich and it lets us do what we want. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, let's give thanks to those things because it helps us fulfill the promise of God. It helps us help other people out. And part of the reason that he's probably very conscious of this is because America was doing a lot of great philanthropic work at this point. There was a massive earthquake in Japan that had happened earlier, and this is probably at least one of the things that Calvin Coolidge is referring to because Americans, not necessarily the government, but Americans privately got together and gave not only financial assistance, but counsel and refuge to the Japanese people that were in need. And they did this with other countries too, but this is just one of the biggest, most headline-grabbing instances of that, probably something that was still on Coolidge's mind when this was going on. And so let us always remember, on a personal level and as a nation, that we should be thankful for the great blessings that we've been given, but we have to remember that with that blessing comes responsibility. With this great prosperity that we have, and we are a very, very blessed people. Calvin Coolidge points that out. We recognize that today. But with those blessings comes the responsibility to help other people. With those blessings comes a call from God Himself to help those that are less fortunate than us. Now, I don't mean to take this passage out of context at all, but I think that this is an apt application to it. I understand that he's talking about spiritual gifts here and the knowledge of the gospel. And I get that that's the direct context of this verse. But when Jesus tells his apostles, freely you have been given, freely give, I think that's a concept that also applies to love and humanitarian aid and sharing your blessings. Of course he's talking about the gospel there. I understand that. He's saying, look, you apostles, you've been given this great gift of the Holy Spirit to understand the mysteries of the kingdom of God. You've been given a lot, and because of that, a lot is expected of you. But the truth is, the same thing goes, the same principle applies to material blessings as well. That in America, we have been given freely, and that is true. We've been given incredibly bountifully and abundantly. And with that comes a responsibility as a nation, not as a government, as a nation, to help those that do not have that same bounty. And on a personal level, that applies to us as well. Now, a little bit later in this same speech, he says, "An abundant prosperity has overspread the land. We shall do well to accept these favors and bounties with a becoming humility." Goes along with what we were just talking about. That you accept these not as, great gifts to say, hey, look how awesome we are and how God has blessed us. We accept them with humility and understand they didn't come from us, and they're not something that's given to us because we earned them or we deserve them. They're given to us as tools to help out other people and to fulfill the call of Christ. And then he continues on in that same sentence, "and dedicate them to the service of the righteous cause of the giver of all and perfect gifts. As the nation has prospered, let all the people show that they are worthy to prosper by rededicating America to the service of God." You see, that last line is really, really important. It goes along with what we've just been talking about, is that since we have been prospered by God, let's remember that and show him we are worthy of his blessings. Now, we're not worthy of his blessings in the sense that we have, rightfully deserved them or anything like that, because that cuts against the gospel. But what he's saying there is, why don't we rise up to this calling? Since we've been given this calling that we're supposed to help other people with our blessings, let us rise up to that. And let us dedicate those blessings to serving the cause of God and helping our fellow man. That's what Calvin Coolidge is hitting at here. He's saying that we are worthy to prosper by rededicating those blessings. If God is going to give those blessings to us, if we want him to continue blessing us, we have to be a blessing to other people. Because once that stops, God has no reason to bless us anymore. Once we stop doing his word, God has less incentive to bless us. And because of that, if we want to continue to be given a blessing, we have to continue to be that blessing to others. It's actually not unlike the parable of the talents. If we want to be given more talents, we have to prove that we are worthy of it, that a workman is worthy of his meat. Now, a little bit further on, and getting close to President Calvin Coolidge's closing here, after he declares the day of Thanksgiving, he says, "I recommend that the people gather in their places of worship, the family altars, and offer up their thanks for the goodness which has been shown to them in such a multitude of ways." Now, granted, you don't have to go almost 100 years into the past to see these kinds of things being very commonplace amongst presidents. I mean, we looked at Ronald Reagan's just last year, and very similar language was used by President Reagan. But can you imagine today, in 2019, a president saying something like this? A president saying, "I'm recommending that everybody gather in their churches and give thanks and prayer to God for what he has given to us." I think that that's incredibly powerful. And because in a lot of ways America has lost that, that's why we've ceased to be good and godly. And once that happens, if we go too far down that road, then we're no longer going to be, as Coolidge just referred to it, worthy to prosper. Once we stop paying homage to God and realizing that our blessings come from him, and once we stop evoking his name and talking about, hey, God is the reason that we're doing this, we need to go out and give thanks for him. Once Thanksgiving just gets distilled into a day to be a slob and a pig and eat turkey and watch football, once it just becomes that, then we're not worthy of it anymore. And I'm afraid that for many, that is the path that we have gone down. I think that there's still a lot of people that really are grateful and really do understand Thanksgiving is primarily supposed to be a day of prayer and to give thanks to God for what we've been given. But there's an awful lot of people that just don't think of it that way. He continues on, "Especially, I urge them to supplicate the throne of grace that they may gather strength from their tribulations, and that they may gain humility from their victories, that they may bear without complaining the burdens that shall be placed upon them, and that they may be increasingly worth in all ways of the blessings that shall come to them." I think this is the most powerful part of the entire declaration if you understand the context in which Coolidge was speaking. You see, to President Coolidge, he was a man that when he said, "Let's go to the throne of grace, that all people may gather strength from their tribulations and then bear without complaining the burdens placed on them," that was something that was very real and present to him because of the losses that he had gone through in his time as president. And that's what I kind of want to make our theme about today: giving thanks in dark times. Coolidge was personally going through an awful lot at this point. But part of the reason he was able to carry on, part of the reason he was able to continue to be an effective president and an effective leader, is because he had a sense of gratitude for what he had been given. You see, the important thing when it comes to gratitude is that it shifts your perspective. It really does change the way you look at a situation. Maybe what had happened with Coolidge is that a day of Thanksgiving helped him shift his perspective from, why did this have to happen to my son, in a really kind of strange freak accident, and something that unfortunately, had they paid attention to just a few hours earlier, it may have saved his life. But instead of dwelling on that, instead of thinking, why did this have to happen to me, he was praying for gratitude of the blessings he had been given, one of which was having that son for 16 years. There's a lot of people that don't even have that. A lot of people have children that die much earlier, some that are stillbirths, some that can't have children at all. And so you see how shifting your perspective just a little and having gratitude for what you have been given, that can give you the strength to get through even the darkest times. I think Coolidge probably had to go through that to be able to continue to be an effective leader even after he had suffered that kind of loss. And the best quote in the whole speech to me is, and this is, by the way, taken directly out of the Bible. This is almost a direct quote, where he says to bear without complaining the burdens that shall be placed upon them. That takes a strength of character that, frankly, I just don't have yet. I hope I get there someday. I don't. To be able to bear that burden without complaining or griping about it, that's a hard thing to do. But the only way that you can do that is if you are grateful for what you have been given. You see, when it comes to temptation, most sin could be curtailed if a little gratitude was added to the situation. Look at how the devil got Eve. The way that he tempted her is he said, why didn't God just let you eat from all the trees in the garden? Why has he denied you this one tree? So instead of focusing on all the trees, all the bounty, all the blessings that God had given to Eve, Satan got her to focus on that one tree that she was forbidden from eating. When it came to David, David not only had one wife, he had multiple wives, which I think actually contributed to the problem when it came to Bathsheba. That if he had just been focusing on his blessings, that would have solved everything. You'll notice that when he is being confronted about his sin with Uriah and Bathsheba, it said, did you not know that God would have granted you anything that you ask him for? Why did you have to take a wife that was unlawful for you to take? Why did you have to take a man's life for this? Why not go to God and ask for a blessing? Why did you have to feel like you had to sneak around and go behind somebody's back? See, if David had actually been grateful for the things that he had instead of focusing on that one thing that he wanted that he didn't have, he would have been just fine. And we could go example by example. King Saul had the same problem. The Apostle Peter had the same problem. You could go through countless different scenarios in which somebody messed up where gratitude would have changed their perspective enough to fix the situation. But that's why gratitude is something that is so important, is because it seems like a little thing. It seems like almost a lesser Christian virtue, and I think sometimes we think of it that way. But the truth is, adding in gratitude, that would actually fix a lot of the sins that we're faced with. focusing on the things that God has done for us as opposed to worrying about the things that we don't have or trying to take something that we feel that we ought to have when God has already blessed us so richly. And that's why I think gratitude is probably most important in dark times, where it seems like the struggles of life are trying to press us down, that if we shift our perspective, we will have the correct perspective to emerge from those situations. I think that it's very telling that the holiday of Thanksgiving was largely not celebrated for about 80 years in our history. And when does it come back into play? In the middle of arguably the darkest time in American history, the Civil War. We were fighting a long and bloody war against ourselves, and President Lincoln says, you know what? We've got to have a day to come together and be grateful for the things that we've been given. He understood that if we don't do that, then there's a good chance we lose this war. There's a good chance that we are torn apart as a people forever if we don't find something to bring us back together. And one thing that everybody on both sides of that war should have been able to agree on is being grateful to God for the blessings that they had been given. Lincoln was wise enough to understand that and say, yeah, this is the time where we need Thanksgiving the most. It seems almost odd in such a dark, bloody time to say, you know what, let's sit down and be thankful. But that's exactly what the nation needed at that point. I don't know what kind of impact it had on the ultimate outcome of the war, but I believe that it did make a difference. You see, the truth is, God can only truly bless people. He can only truly bless people that are grateful for it. Because he could give things to people that are not grateful for it all he wants to, and they'll never truly be blessed because they'll never truly appreciate it. And without that appreciation, without that perspective, they can't be blessed. They're not going to feel the effects of the blessings that he gives to them. There are plenty of rich people that are incredibly greedy because all they want is more. There are people that have been blessed with lots of children or a loving family that all they're doing is looking at people that don't necessarily have those things but have a great career or have more money or something like that, and they start looking after that thing that they don't have. Let's remember to always be grateful for the blessings that we've been given, because God can only truly bless somebody who's truly grateful for it. We'll go to a quick break and we'll come back with more on our Thanksgiving Day special.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now it's time once again for another reading of the SJW Bible. Today's story is going to be about how Naaman was cured of his leprosy in 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 8 through 14. And it says, "It happened when Elisha, the man and or woman of God, depending on how he identified at the time, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, and he sent word to the king, saying, 'Why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel.' So Naaman came with his horse and his chariots, which were sustainably raised and emitted no greenhouse gases, and stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, 'Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean.' Not that I'm implying that you were dirty just because you were a leper. That would be leper shaming. But Naaman was furious and went away, saying, 'Behold, I thought, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand all over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Paphra and the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?' So he turned and went away in rage. Then his servants came near and spoke to him, saying, 'Wow, that Elisha guy is such a xenophobic jerk. Where does he get off implying that the rivers in Israel are better than the rivers in our country? That nationalist jerk probably believes in Israeli exceptionalism too.' So then God spoke to Naaman directly and said, 'Naaman, I am so sorry for being intolerant and not accommodating enough. I should never have asked you to have to go and do something to be cured. You believe in me, and since purification comes from faith only, I'll just go ahead and heal you right here and now." And from that hour forward, his flesh was cured, and they all went out to try some local craft beer. Wow, so inspirational. Thank you for listening to this reading of the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
And welcome back, everybody. Thank you for being with us through the break. I had a couple things that I wanted to talk about since it is Thanksgiving. First of all, just from a personal note, 5 things that I'm really grateful for. The first is my health. And that's something that was not always a guarantee. I kind of thought that it was. It was just sort of a given to me that my health was always in pretty good status. And I mean, for the vast majority of my life, it was. I had nothing to complain about from that standpoint. I mean, I was somebody that until the time I was, I think, 28, when I was diagnosed with cancer, I had not been to the doctor since I was, I believe, 8 years old, maybe 9. And so I was just somebody that didn't get sick. And then I got really sick. And I got to tell you, being sick makes you really grateful for having your health once it's back. And it even makes you grateful for the little spans where you don't feel all that terrible, even while you are sick. And I think that that really teaches an important lesson about gratitude, is that sometimes we have to lose the thing, we have to lose the blessing that we've been given to really understand what a blessing it is. I'm also really grateful, number 2, for my jobs. I've got 2 really great jobs, and then I also preach occasionally on the side, so I got to tell you, I have been very blessed that all 3 of my jobs, all 3 of them, have an aspect where I can include my faith in them. Because I work at Faulkner University, I work with a lot of the young people here, I get to talk about faith, I get to be very open about that. And you know, since I do the Chaplain's Report every day at News Radio 1440 on this show, that this is also a job where I get to share my faith. And of course, you know, occasionally filling in for different preachers around the area, being a minister, that's something that helps me out greatly with that too. So I'm very thankful for all 3 of my jobs. I'm thankful not only that I get to go out and make a paycheck and make money, but more importantly, that my jobs are a part of who I am, and that in all 3 of them, there are opportunities to share the gospel. I realize there's a lot of people that is not the case for. That the vast majority of people don't have those kinds of opportunities, and I'm very grateful for that my jobs have that. Third, I'm very grateful for my liberty. I understand more and more how difficult it is living in other countries when things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion are not guarantees. I've been to a couple of those countries. And granted, the ones that I've been to, it's not nearly as bad as it is in some other countries. I saw a great Babylon Bee article, and this is one thing I appreciate about the Babylon Bee, is it occasionally takes a minute to make fun of Christians. I mean, it makes fun of the left, it makes fun of atheists, and it makes fun of people that are seen as enemies of Christianity too. It does that. But it also pokes fun at Christians, and I love that. I love that we can poke fun at ourselves and have a good time with one another. They put out an article the other day, and it said that there was a group of Chinese Christians that were praying for the safety and praying for the spiritual strength for their brothers in America that now have to go somewhere else to get chicken sandwiches. Which, like, I made a big deal out of the Chick-fil-A thing. I did, and you can look and see my commentary on that. If you go to my YouTube channel right now, I've got like a 20-minute video, and that's the short version of me ranting about the Chick-fil-A situation. But it does put it into perspective that, look, the things that we're dealing with, it's not that they're not serious. It's not that they're not important to us and important in the spiritual battle that we go on every day. But let's not pretend it's anything like living in China where for sharing the gospel with somebody, you can be sent to a re-education camp. Like, it's not that. And the fact that it's not that is cause for celebration and is cause for gratitude. And because we have that liberty, it should also remind us that we have a responsibility to be with those and to pray for those that are not as lucky as us, to live in a country where freedom of religion is something that is at least on paper granted. And in most cases, we do have a considerable amount of religious liberty compared to the rest of the world. It's not perfect. We still suffer religious persecution, but it's not to the level that it is in a lot of those other nations. Fourth, I'm thankful for the church. The church has been so great to me. In a lot of ways, it's the reason that I'm alive today. They help pay for a lot of my treatments. They help get me through that very difficult time going through the medical process, but far more than that. And I've had the great opportunity to get to know a lot of my church brothers and sisters. I genuinely don't see how people live without church. I don't. It just blows my mind. You know how there are people that are, well, we use this one because everybody can relate to it. You look back at, if you're living in the South, if you look back and you're like, how did people even function without air conditioner? Or how did people even function without the ability to have running water in the house? Things like that. With me, it's even more pronounced than that. It's almost like, how did people function without the wheel? To me, that's as basic as it is when it comes to the church. I look at people that just go through life as atheists or people that declare that they're Christians but don't actually go to church, and I'm like, I don't even see how they get up in the morning. Like, what do you have to live for? What do you have to move forward? What motivates you? What drives you, and how do you find family and friends when you don't have that basis of a faith? I'm not making fun of them. I'm just saying I genuinely don't understand how they do it. The church has been so much to me. They really have been my family, and they were my family when my family was falling apart, and they were my family when I was going through all kinds of different things, mentally, physically, and spiritually. They're there for me no matter what, and I genuinely have a hard time even comprehending how people function in life without having that basis that's always there. I'm grateful that I've never had to experience life like that. There have always been a family of believers that are willing to surround me and help me and encourage me, and it also gives me some motivation to try to do the same to them. And then finally, and this kind of goes along with the last one that we were talking about, I'm grateful for the people around me. And this goes with friends and family and even my enemies, even people that don't like me very much and challenge me and challenge my ideas on a regular basis. I'm thankful for them too. Sometimes those things overlap. Sometimes my family challenges me in certain ways as well, not to the level of being an enemy, but you understand what I'm saying. The fact that there are other people to have fellowship with and to laugh with and also to test one another. And sometimes to see if our ideas really stack up and if they really are right. And sometimes because we need that correction, we need that other person to step in and say, hey, what you're doing here, maybe not such a good idea. Maybe you should think about adjusting that. Those are all blessings in and of themselves. And I really do think that God, both from a perspective of your friends and your family and from the people that don't necessarily like you all that much, I think that he puts the right people in your life that you need at that time. Sometimes there are people that we don't understand why they are in our lives at that time, but even with them, I think God has a purpose and there is a lesson to be learned from that. And so I'm thankful for the people in my life. Actually, we have a couple of other Thanksgiving stories before we wrap things up and go to the chaplain's report today. This one is absurd, but not for the reasons that a lot of people are putting out there. J.C. Penney's is opening for Black Friday deals at 2 p.m. tomorrow on Thanksgiving Day at 2 p.m. So I guess you got to wrap up your Thanksgiving by 1:30. This is so patently absurd to me. But here's the thing. It is absurd, and we recognize that it's incredibly stupid and over the top. But here's what we have to do. We have to ask ourselves why. Because I was reading the article that I got this news from, and it's from a very far left-leaning publication, and it was talking about how they're abusing their employees and how it all boils down to corporate greed and all these other things. It does boil down to greed, But it's not just corporate greed. Because here's the thing. I'm not saying that the owners don't have any blame in this, and I'm not saying that it's not a stupid, ridiculous policy to open at this time, and I'm not saying that they are being completely inconsiderate of their employees and the people that work there when they make a decision like this. However, why are they opening at 2 p.m.? No business would do that if they were not convinced that there are going to be people there that are going to spend lots of money. They are opened at 2 p.m. because there are Black Friday shoppers that are going to show up at 2 p.m. Make no mistake, they are following market forces. Not saying it justifies it, not saying it makes it okay or absolves them of any responsibility. I'm saying if you're going to point the fingers at business owners, you got some fingers pointing back at you. If you are somebody that goes out on Black Friday, especially the ones that actually go out before Black Friday even starts, they go out on Thursday, you are feeding this monster. You have absolutely no right whatsoever to complain about this if you're one of the people that goes out there to get the deals and goes out there on Thursday. If you go out on Black Friday morning, I think you may be dumb. I may not understand it, but you're not contributing to that at least. If you're one of those people that goes out there on Thursday, you're part of the problem. You are part of the masses that are feeding this behemoth that a couple of years from now, I think that we're just going to have to move Thanksgiving to Wednesday or something because people are so freaking determined to save $20 on something that they will act like complete animals and run over people and leave and abandon their family on Thanksgiving to save money on a stupid Christmas present. Or not even necessarily a Christmas present, just something for them. It has always bothered me that people try to stretch Christmas out into basically 2 months of the year. But this is probably the most egregious example of it. That they're just saying, you know what, we're just going to completely skip actually giving thanks to God for all the things that he's given us this year so that we can save some money. So yes, corporate greed is definitely playing a part of this decision. But guess what? The greed of the masses, the greed of the people that are willing to do this, ultimately they're the ones that are to blame too. You can't ignore that aspect of it. And this is another story that I just had to do this one. I love this story so much. So there is a story that I read coming out of New York. There was a home invader that broke into this lady's apartment named Willie Murphy. And if I'm going to talk about things that I'm thankful for this Thanksgiving, I am thankful for stories like this, which just make my job an absolute pleasure. Typically, stories like this where there's a little old lady, 82 years old, has her home broken into by a young man, big, strong guy, breaks into her apartment. We don't really know what he was going to doing, what he was planning on doing, and that is because she stopped him. Now, 9 times out of 10, if I give you all those details and you're thinking, this is another story about somebody, a good guy with a gun. Nope. Didn't have a gun. Well, maybe if you saw a few episodes ago, me doing the story about the little old lady that whopped the guy with the baseball bat, you might be thinking, it's one of the, nope. This lady, 82 years old, fought off a home invader completely unarmed, because she's also a professional bodybuilder. I love stories like this, and you'll see why. This is the story of Miss Willie Murphy. We're going to go ahead and look at the newscast reporting this. Hat tip to ABC 7 News in New York, by the way.
A man who broke into an elderly woman's home in Rochester, New York, definitely picked the wrong house. Turns out the 82-year-old woman is an award-winning weightlifter. A crowd gathered around Willie Murphy at her gym as she shared the story of what happened to her on Thursday. She says the man first knocked on her door claiming to be sick and asked to call an ambulance. She made the call, but all of a sudden saw that he had broken down her door.
I'm alone and I'm old, but guess what? I'm tough. I took that table and I went to working on him, and guess what? The table broke.
Love it. Police say the suspect was intoxicated. He was taken to the hospital. Murphy is not pressing charges, but she now has an impressive story to share with all her friends.
Don't mess with Miss Willie. That's the lesson. That's the takeaway for that. The best part of that is she's just like, I took up a table and started working on it. I don't even know how to make that. I can't give any commentary that makes that story any better. Now, I'm not in great shape, but I'm in decent shape. I don't think I could pick up a table and start working on somebody that came into my home. I don't think I could pull that off. But this old lady is basically the Incredible Hulk. She just picks up a table and starts beating a dude with it. I don't know why, but that story tickled me so much. I hope y'all got half as much entertainment out of that as I did. But here's the thing. Bodybuilder or not, even though this lady, granted, he did pick the wrong house. There's no question about that. But whether she was a bodybuilder or not, you know that dude's life in prison is going to be freaking miserable. Because he's going to be walking around there and he's got the reputation as the guy that's there because an 82-year-old woman beat him with a table and broke a table while doing so. I mean, I'm sorry, you've got no street cred at that point. This little old lady is just she's not only like put him in prison, she's made it even, prison's going to be even worse for this guy because that's how he wound up there. Because word about that is going to get around. And her friend, longtime friend of Miss Willie, Jim Marin, he said this, quote, "I probably weigh close to twice as much as her. I wouldn't want to tango with her. Don't mess with Willie." So way to go, Miss Murphy. I think that her friend and neighbor, Jim Marin, there is 100% right. I'm glad that they did this report. Don't mess with little old ladies because you never know when you're going to run up against one that is an award-winning bodybuilder. Kudos to you, Miss Murphy, and we wish you the best. Have a happy Thanksgiving. All right, let's go on to the daily dose of stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
For today's daily dose of stupid, this one actually comes from Macon County. A mom there said that her school encouraging her daughter to dress up as a Native American as part of a Thanksgiving celebration was racist. Now, keep in mind, if you were just asking, even if you didn't say Native American specifically, just asking children to dress up as the people at the original Thanksgiving meal would have necessarily meant you either had to dress like a pilgrim or a Native American. There would be no other options. Like, you can't just show up looking like you're from, I don't know, Jersey Shore or wearing camo or something like that, because if you were to dress like them, the period clothing would be that. I also noticed that, I don't know if the kids were encouraged to dress up like pilgrims either, but pretty sure all the pilgrims were white. So if there's a racial aspect of one, I don't know why there wouldn't be a racial aspect of the other. But anyway, trying not to get ahead of myself here. This is a report from AL.com. April Arthurs, whose 5-year-old son attends Central School, is a member of the Mohawk tribe. After learning of a planned powwow for kindergartners, Arthurs wrote a letter to the principal saying in part, quote, "I wish to state very clearly, dressing up as a stereotype of a culture is racist, even if it's children, even if it's just for fun, even if no one has spoken up before now, even if this has been going on for decades." You know, I get that the reason that you come to this show is because I'm well versed in debate and I know how to break down arguments. Now, watch me, because this is a very easy argument to break. It is so easy, in fact. I can break it with literally a single word. Why? So often, when we get in debates like this, people make the mistake of immediately defending their position. This one, you don't have to defend it at all. Force them to defend it. Because she's making the statement that you just heard me read, that children dressing up as a stereotype of a culture is automatically racist. No matter how long they've been doing it, that's all you have to ask. Why? Explain to me why it's racist. How are children dressing up like a cultural stereotype? How is it racist? Why is it racist? See, that's the problem. If you ask them to dig deeper, they can't explain it, because everything that this woman says, all the quotes, looking through the letter that she sent in, everything assumes that it is racist, but never actually explains why. is racist. And sometimes the easiest way to break an argument is just ask them to clarify their own position. Because I got to tell you, a lot of the times, not every time, but a lot of the times, they can't do it. And I would be willing to bet, and I don't know, maybe this woman actually would be able to do this if presented the opportunity. But a lot of times people make the mistake of just assuming that they have a point or accepting the fact, or at the very least, accepting the premise that they put down there and go into defense mode. Sometimes it's smarter to just say, well, can you explain to me why it's that way? Because usually they will be unable to do that. A good example here, Vikings are a racial stereotype. They're from Scandinavian countries. People dress up as them all the time in different operas. They do so at Vikings football games with Minnesota. This is a common thing. People walk around wearing Viking helmets. That's a cultural stereotype. It's not. It's actually tied to a specific race. Why is that not racist? Knights exclusively happened in Europe. Knights had a racial identity because they were all from that sort of Western European tradition. In fact, my family, we, on my father's side, are the descendant of a clan of knights. I don't complain when somebody dresses up as a knight. That's a cultural stereotype. I wouldn't even care if a, Hispanic guy or a black guy dressed up as a knight. Doesn't bother me. In fact, and this is another thing that's funny, it wasn't very popular, but there's even a movie that I'm familiar with called The Black Knight, where it's a guy from modern America, I think Philadelphia, goes back in time, and he's in the Middle Ages, and he's a black guy as a knight. Well, the reason that's funny is because there is a racial identity tied to knights. They are of a specific race, but in this particular case, there was a black guy that was dressed up as a knight, which is fine. Didn't offend me. I don't care if they do that. See, this assumption that anytime you dress as a cultural stereotype that's racist, no, it's not. That's absurd. And the left only does that when it's a race that is not white. That's the only way that you ever hear anything about that, saying it's culturally insensitive or something like that. They always do that. And this happens every Thanksgiving. This one just happened to be in our home state, and that's the reason I wanted to highlight it a little bit. But I don't care if another race dresses as a Viking or a knight. Pirates, not so much, because they're pirates of all different races, but there's a lot of different stereotypes that are associated with being white. It doesn't bother me if they do it. And let's also keep in mind that I'm at least 1/32nd Native American. Probably not as much as this person. But in the intersectionality game, I don't think that it matters one way or the other. The amount of, Native American or any kind of racial demographic or breakdown that you can be doesn't weigh or outweigh the strength of my argument. Now, if there were people that were specifically getting around to mock a race, that would be different, and this is where her next quote comes in. Traditional headdresses, the ones everyone thinks about, the big feathers and everything, the ones that everyone thinks about with the big feathers, that's an incredibly sacred item to very specific tribes. There's a prayer in every stitch, there's a meaning in every bead and feather. To make a mock-up of it is yucky. First of all, whoa, step back now. Look at the rhetorical genius there. Well, I didn't know it was yucky. I guess I should stay away from it. The word choice some people use here. But here's the thing. It's totally wrong to mock it. I agree. If you're putting on the dress of a Native American to mock it and to make fun of a person's race, that would be wrong. Yeah, I totally understand that. But we were just using knights, for example. Knights had a religious draw to them, especially paladins. That's the reason that European knights typically have crosses adorning their armor. Still doesn't bother me if somebody dresses up at it. If they're doing so to make fun of it, okay, maybe then it does offend me a little bit, but I'm not offended by the fact that they dressed as a cultural stereotype. I'm offended by them mocking the religion underlying it. See, that's a completely different argument. And by the way, sometimes I don't even mind that. I mean, look at some of Mel Brooks' work on that. It's hilarious. But if you're putting on some kind of particular dress to mock somebody, I can see how that would be wrong. But even then, the act of dressing like them is not what's being called into question here. It's the mocking It's the intent. And that's what really makes the difference here. If it's a tribute, or if it's like in this particular case, to learn about a culture, that's not degrading. And another thing that's funny about this is she's talking about the stereotypical big feather headdresses and that kind of thing. Well, that was typically the Plains Indians. They weren't even Indians that lived around here. See, what we think of as the stereotypical Native American, because the Plains Indians and their culture lived on longer, the teepees and riding around on horses and bows and arrows, that was mostly them. And because those tribes survived longer, we got more of that, and we kind of started to think that all people, all Native Americans lived like that, when the truth is that's not the case for the vast majority of the Americans that were inhabiting the East. And so because of that, it's funny that she seems to bring that up without even acknowledging that that's not even how the Indians would have looked, at least in this area of the country in Alabama. So but here's the thing, and this is the final word on this that I think is appropriate. If you don't want your kid to participate, that's fine. I don't think that you should be forced to. I don't think that you should say, no, you're going to dress like an Indian and you're going to like it. No, I think the parental authority here is ultimate. And even if I completely disagree with her ideas, even if I think she's dead wrong on this, she has a right to raise her kid the way that she wants to, even if I think that she's wrong. But don't ruin it for everybody else. If they want to raise their kids like that, if they think that this is something that is good and appropriate and culturally beneficial for them to dress like Native Americans and learn about their culture and learn what they would have lived like, then don't ruin it for them. If you don't want your kid to do it, that's fine. But don't assume that you know best and you ought to be raising everybody else's kids. See, I want to afford you the liberty to raise your child the way that you want to. And if you think this is a bad idea, or you think that this is not something that would help them in that, not participating, I'm fine with that. But please extend that same courtesy to other parents. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Our chaplain's report today is, of course, and I know that this is no surprise considering my giant Thanksgiving background here, it's going to be on Thanksgiving. Because it is something that is repeated over and over again in the Bible. I think that it's something that we may not really focus on as much as we should, because the Bible talks about it a lot. Old Testament, New Testament, thanksgiving and gratitude are very important virtues to the Christian faith. And I think that a great example of that, especially with our theme of giving thanks in dark times, comes from the book of Colossians. So we'll look at Colossians chapter 4, verses 2 through 4. Paul writes, "Devote yourselves to prayer. Keep alert with an attitude of thanksgiving, praying at the same time for us as well, that God will open up to us as a door for the word, so that we may speak forth the mystery of Christ, for which I have also been imprisoned, that I may make it clear in the way that I ought to speak." There's a couple things that I want you to notice about this verse. First of all, in the part where he's talking about Thanksgiving, he is advising the church at Colossae. He is advising them to devote themselves to prayer, and always done with an attitude of thanksgiving. Now, why is that? I think that the reason that's so important is because he's saying we're facing a lot of adversity. We're facing a lot of things that we don't need to deal with, a lot of things that are keeping us from sharing the word of God with others. And so what I'm asking you to do is to devote yourself to prayer. What does it mean to devote yourself to something? It means you take it seriously. It means that you do so regularly, constantly, that it's something that you have made a commitment, you have made an oath to do. He's saying, I don't just want you to pray for this, like a one-off prayer request. Hey, would you say a quick prayer for me? Okay. Nothing wrong with that. But that's not what Paul is asking for. He's saying, I want you to devote yourselves, to make it an integral part of your spiritual life, to pray for us, to pray for our well-being, and to pray for the success of our mission, and to do so with an attitude of thanksgiving. Now, that implies a couple things. First of all, it implies that to keep alert with this attitude of thanksgiving that Paul is talking about takes diligence. You see, it's not a light switch that you can turn on and off. You can't just be thankful for something. There's a difference in saying thank you and living thanksgiving out, having that attitude of thanksgiving. Because being grateful for something, saying thank you and thanking somebody, that's a great thing. That's something that all of our moms told us to do when we were little, and hopefully it's something that carried on through adulthood. It is a good quality to have. But it's not sufficient for the Christian faith. You see, to do thanks the way that God wants us to give thanks, it's constant, and it changes you. It's a integral part of your spiritual life. It's not something that you just do once something good happens. It's not like your parents taught you the very rudimentary sort of childlike thanks that they gave you, which, is a good starting point. Don't get me wrong. But it's not like that where somebody gives you a present or somebody gives you food and you say thank you. It's where you live a life that is changed and altered because you have gratitude for them. What was being instructed here is, look at what Jesus Christ has done for you. Because of that, I want you to devote yourself to prayer, and I want you to live a life in a constant state of thanksgiving, and be alert and intentional with it, because this isn't something that is just going to happen. You have to make a conscious, constant effort to devote yourself to gratitude. Because as humans, we're naturally selfish. We naturally forget to say thank you. That's why you have to teach children to do it. Because if our natural state was gratitude, you wouldn't have to tell a kid to do that. They would have it on their own and maybe learn not to be grateful later. It's not like that. When you give something to a very young child, they're not thinking about being grateful. They're just like, give me mine. That's the attitude of most 2- and 3-year-olds because they haven't learned that yet. But the truth is, as adults, we're not that much more mature. Most of the time we're given something, especially when it comes to God, we'll pray for something and get what we want, and then we forget to say thank you afterward. I know I've been guilty of it a lot. And I've, tried to do better. But gratitude takes a certain level of devotion and intentionality. And then Paul asks not only to do this with yourselves in your own spiritual life, but praying at the same time for us as well. And this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the program with Calvin Coolidge. You remember in his address, he said that we need to be worthy of our prosperity. We need to use the gifts and the power that God has given to us as a blessing to bless other people and to help them. Paul is saying exactly the same thing here in a different way. He's saying when you have this attitude of thanksgiving, when you are keeping alert, when you're constantly devoting yourself to prayer, hey, include us in that, because we want those blessings to be showered on us so that we can use them to bring the word of God to other people. They didn't want blessings for their own prosperity. They didn't want blessings so that they could afford that really nice house out in Jerusalem or anything like that. They were saying, hey, would you please kind of help us here, because we're facing some adversity. We're facing some people that are trying to prevent us from spreading God's word, and we need God's power. We need your prayers. We need your thanksgiving and your blessings so that we can use that as tools to further the cause of the kingdom. And he said, and also, and I think that this shows a lot of Paul's humility, pray that I will be good at this. Pray that God is going to give me the right things to speak. Pray that all of the things that I have been given, that I use them correctly, and that God will make it clear what I am going to say. And in the context of that, you may notice in verse 3 that he says, for which I have also been imprisoned, talking about trying to spread the word. Paul wrote this from a jail cell. You talk about being grateful in dark times. It doesn't get much darker than what Paul was going through. I mean, at this point in his ministry, he had already been beaten, stoned, chased out of countless towns, and now he's in prison for doing the right thing. He's in prison for doing exactly what God told him to do. When you hear the phrase, no good deed goes unpunished, boy, Paul lived that on a daily basis. He was constantly trying to do the right thing, doing what God asked him to do, and constantly suffering for it. And you look at that and you go, how does somebody like that keep going? This verse tells us. It's because he devoted himself to prayer and stayed alert with an attitude of being grateful, an attitude of thanksgiving. Thanksgiving's a great holiday, but it can't just be a one-day thing, especially not for a Christian. Maybe it's a time to focus a little more on it than other times of the year, but ultimately, if we're going to be able to dodge and withstand the assaults of darkness that come on us on a daily basis, one of the things that we're going to have is being grateful for the things that we've been given. And to have that always in the back of our mind, and to have a sense of peace that comes from seeing those blessings as they really are, and to remember that they come from God. Ultimately, it's what kept Paul going. It kept him moving, and it gave him the correct perspective he needed to continue to soldier on and to spread the word of God. And he was grateful for the blessings that he had been given because it allowed him to spread the word to more people, which made him more grateful. And so there was this exchange going on between him and God, where God would bless him so that he could continue to do God's work. And in return, Paul would offer prayers and thanks for that. And in return, God would continue to give more blessings and look out for him. And that's the way that it constantly gets. See, Paul could have complained. Paul had a lot of things that he would have been very well justified and humanized for complaining about. And he's looking at it and saying, would you please pray that I get out of prison just so I can spread the word of God more? Actually, he doesn't even pray to get out of prison. He prays to give him the opportunity to spread the word of God to others. And you know what? Paul, in the account of Acts and in several other historic accounts that we have, he did that from a prison cell. He didn't even necessarily say, hey, pray that I get out of bondage. He said, just pray that I have the opportunity to spread the word no matter where I am. That can only come from somebody that has a deep and abiding sense of gratitude. And it's one that if we want to be effective torchbearers of the cause of Christ, it's something that we have to adopt too. Happy Thanksgiving. Stay the course, friends.
Is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of